First up, the future of Wyoming's open spaces. Nearly 50% of the land area of our state is public land. This includes national parks, forests, wildlife refuges, and lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Polls show consistently that Wyoming voters oppose selling off any of these lands, an idea touted by some congressmen and some state legislators to eliminate deficits. Wyoming Wildlife Federation Executive Director Chamois Andersen joined in on the conversation with our Pat Wolfenbarger.
Can you tell us about the Wyoming Wildlife Federation is?
The Wyoming Wildlife Federation is the oldest sportsman and conservation organization in the state. We were founded in 1937. We've got approximately 2,000 members, as well as a growing list of supporters, 10,000 strong. And we're dedicated to wildlife conservation, habitat, making sure our habitat is healthy for a variety of animals, and also being the voice of hunters and anglers for the state when it comes to the Wyoming legislature and resource management plans.
Public lands, it's a pretty topical issue right now across the country. So what are you trying to do right now to educate and advocate?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's becoming increasingly a serious movement politically across the West as state legislators introduce land grab bills with the attempt to transfer public lands to state ownership and state control. And many feel that this is unlikely because it would actually take Congress to approve such measures. However, our fear as a wildlife organization and also the fear of our conservation partners is as this political movement gains momentum and more bills reach state legislatures and there's more political dollars and special interest money going toward this effort, that it could be possible. And transferring our federal lands to the states would be to the detriment of everyone, every American who owns these lands, not to mention the wildlife and the habitat and access for our hunters and anglers that so value our public lands.
So are there specific things that you're doing right now to influence the public, influence decision makers?
Yes, well, I have to say our mission includes promoting public lands for our outdoor recreation, for wildlife habitat, and for access for hunting and fishing. And unfortunately, the last couple of years, we've had to switch gears and work harder to protect these lands. I'd like to get back into promoting them, but what's been happening is every year the legislature is starting to see these bills come up, land grab bills, the transferring of public lands to the state. And so we are at the legislature every session, keeping our eye on these bills that come up, and when they do, we immediately let our membership know about these bills. And last year was a great example of two pieces of legislation that were introduced during a budget session. Mm-hmm. And we immediately sent out an email blast and notified our large membership to contact their representatives to say, no, we oppose these land grab bills. And it worked. The two bills were dead on arrival. So, but that takes a lot of work and resources and mobilization. And you know, that's something we're focused on because there's nothing more important than having access to hunting and fishing and having wildlife corridors and migrations intact. And so this is something we'll continue to fight. We'd like to not have to fight for it because really these are supposed to be lands that Teddy Roosevelt helped to put aside for perpetuity, forever.
So what are you doing on the local level?
On the local level, that's a really good question. So parallel with the legislative initiatives that we've seen come up in terms of public land grab bills, there's also an effort by the state through the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. It's called the Wyoming Public Lands Initiative. And essentially there are 45 wilderness study areas across the state. And these areas have been in this kind of limbo status for, about 30 years. And so Governor Meade and the Wyoming delegation and now the counties have indicated that they would like to see these areas reviewed and considered whether they should be a capital W, full wilderness, whether they should be released or directly managed. And so they've initiated a statewide process that is actually county by county to look at wilderness study areas within each county. And what that will entail is the counties devising or creating advisory committees, groups of stakeholders of all interest, to make sure that there's this collaborative effort going toward looking at these areas, seeing how productive they are, if they can be more productive, if there's some small land swaps that might be considered to make sure they're not isolated or there's this checkerboard land management situation going on. And to obviously for our interest is to consider, the wildlife corridors, the critical winter habitat for elk, for example, the access to hunting and fishing, and to make sure that all the data and information associated with these areas will be considered for each county process. So this is starting this spring and will continue for, they've indicated through 2018, in which case the plan is for one legislative package to be created for Wyoming that our delegation would then to submit to Congress in the form of a bill. And if it's at the local level, in other words, if we have the stakeholder involvement and these recommendations for these public lands created at that level in one package, then Congress will hopefully look at it and will approve it. Our concern, however, with this process, and something we want to differentiate or make a distinction for, is the large-scale transfer of public lands. Mm-hmm. We are in favor of looking at wilderness study areas, and we will be a part of that process and at the table as sportsmen, making sure our interests are considered. But we are vehemently opposed to large-scale land transfers, and that's where we don't want this discussion to evolve into, transferring national forests and BLM lands to the state for the state to manage. That could be to the detriment of our wildlife and habitat and access. The state is on a parallel track, back with legislation, considering how much it would cost for the state to manage federal lands. 2 years ago, the legislature passed a bill that granted $75,000 toward a feasibility study to see if the state could, financially cover the cost for such a land management. And we know that that's going to be quite expensive. Federal land management activities, environmental reviews, public comments, land management, in general, with all the work that it entails, it costs money. We feel there's better ways to help mitigate for the lack or the decrease in funding for public lands management, as opposed to the state trying to take control and manage it. So there's a lot going on with public lands, and we are an organization that will stand up for our sportsmen, for our wildlife conservation community, and we have numerous partners that we're collaborating with on this effort, including the Wyoming Sportsmen's Alliance, of which there are 8 sportsman groups that we've collected together to make sure we have a sportsman on every committee for this wilderness study area and other public lands they will be looking at with this process.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Chamois.
Thank you.